Good afternoon and welcome everyone. We've got some 60 people here already and more joining for this webinar or the first of a webinar series which marks the coming to an end of the Infrastructure Transitions Research Consortium program. We had hoped to hold a large event in London, which many of you will be able to come to, as we have done a number of times during our research program, but clearly we've moved online, which provides the opportunity to engage, hopefully, with an even larger number of people. And the way we're organizing it is to have this big picture webinar today, and then a series of more focused webinars, which I'll introduce in a moment over the coming couple of months. This marks the end of the ITRC program, as I say, but it's always the case with good research that it never ends. And ITRC certainly falls into that category in that, first of all, we have a great legacy of products and outputs and impacts and uptake, some of which we're going to talk about today and in the subsequent seminars. And also, doing research always raises new questions. And there are many other research initiatives which are already underway, which I'll briefly mention just some of them at the end of my short presentation. The aim of this webinar then is really to promote the uptake of all of that legacy from ITRC and to encourage people's involvement in all of the follow-on research activities, as well as to some extent celebrating what we've all done in the ITRC program over the last 10 years. This webinar is going to be organized as follows. In a moment, I'm going to show a short video, or in fact, Tim will show a short video. I'll do a short talk to provide an overview of the main things that we've done in the ITRC program and what the main impacts are. We'll have two responses, one from James Richardson, Chief Economist of the National Infrastructure Commission, and one from Mark Enzer from Mott MacDonald and Chair of the Digital Framework Task Group. And then we'll have some discussion, and you'll be able to enter your questions on the chat, and I will endeavour to both answer those questions and pass them on to our two respondents and to the many ITRC researchers who are here on the line with us. I've also been encouraged to draw your attention to the social media, which is right here. So please, can you do all the usual stuff with LinkedIn and Twitter. And I should finally say that this is a moment for celebration. It's also a moment for thanks. And I shouldn't go any further without thanking the 7 universities which make up the ITRC, the 70 or so academics, researchers, PhD students who've been part of the ITRC program, our advisory board and client group who've given us valued guidance throughout the program, and of course the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, which have funded 2 phases of the ITRC program grant. And with that, I'll hand over to Tim to show you a brief video.
Energy, water, transport, Waste. Digital communications. Essential infrastructure provides the backdrop for the lives we lead. In a world of accelerating technological, social and climatic change, the infrastructure decisions that policymakers and practitioners take today have never been more important. That's because infrastructure decisions are crucial moments in fixing a society's future pathway. The billions we spend on planning and building infrastructure today will determine how we live in the decades to come, and whether that's sustainable. So it's vital to get those decisions right. Historically, infrastructure decision-making has often been siloed and short-termist. In spite of the deep interdependence of infrastructure sectors, for example between water supply and the electricity used to pump water, researchers have struggled to consolidate datasets, understand systems, and share methodologies from outside their infrastructure fields. But that's changing. NISMOD, the National Infrastructure Systems Model, is the product of 10 years of groundbreaking research by the Infrastructure Transitions Research Consortium. And it's already proven its worth in practice time and time again. The world's first system of systems modelling capability, NISMOD encompasses all these infrastructure sectors and, crucially, the interactions between them, enabling researchers to model, test and plan future infrastructure scenarios. That provides the evidence that decision-makers need to ensure that they're making choices that will meet their long-term goals, and can provide infrastructure systems that are resilient to an uncertain future.
What Itrc has done is built a set of models, tools, data sets, methodologies, which enable us to explore scenarios, options for the future, and provide evidence for decision makers and all sorts of other people to understand what the future holds with respect to infrastructure, what the choices are, and how they might decide to do something sustainable.
If we're going to really meet the challenges of climate change, this idea that we'll just build our way out of this and we'll just provide for something that's, we don't know yet, it's just going to have to stop. So we're going to need models like this to test, what are we prepared to do? How dense are we prepared to live? How much impact are we prepared to allow on the environment? What are we prepared to give up to gain something? We can start to pick, we can start to choose the kind of future we want and the types of impacts that might come from that future and then deal with them. So it's a fantastic tool, fantastic opportunity for us.
People instinctively understand the need for a systems approach that looks at the big picture. NISMOD provides the tools to make that a reality, and the benefits are already being seen in practice around the world. In Britain, the ITRC's analysis for the National Infrastructure Commission has provided evidence which helped to shape the UK's National Infrastructure Assessment, one of the most comprehensive long-term studies in the world. The ITRC's work with the National Infrastructure Commission has focused on modelling shifting demand for infrastructure services in the UK, looking at likely scenarios and alternatives in population growth, employment patterns, technological change and climate change. We used these scenarios to model the implications for water supply and the rollout of 5G mobile communications. And we provided the world-leading risk and resilience network model that enabled the National Infrastructure Commission to pinpoint vulnerabilities in Britain's infrastructure networks and understand the steps needed to protect the UK's infrastructure from climatic disasters and man-made threats, and the likely economic and social consequences of infrastructure breakdowns. That advanced methodology has since been applied across the world, in Argentina, Tanzania, Vietnam, China, New Zealand. We're working with the United Nations Office for Project Services to develop and use tools for evidence-based decision-making about infrastructure planning in developing countries, particularly those prone to natural and other disasters, such as Curacao, Ghana and St. Lucia.
The analysis and tools provide us with the capacity to underpin future cross-ministerial long-term infrastructure planning in Curacao. The work done with UNOPS helps us to undertake integrated national infrastructure planning of public and private investments, much needed to address our future challenges.
As part of St. Lucia's National Infrastructure Assessment, NISMOD was used to stress test the effects of a 1-metre rise in sea levels, a 4-metre storm surge, and other scenarios to determine how best to invest to ensure resilience. And NISMOD has not just shown its value at the national level. The platform allows researchers to study infrastructure needs and interactions at a very local, granular level, as in the Itrc's analysis using NISMOD of the plans for the Oxford-Cambridge Arc. Taking a variety of different population growth assumptions, our modelling is helping planners develop a clear vision for housing, transport, water, digital communications and energy in the Arc, incorporating both grey infrastructure and green, nature-based solutions.
What's clear about the Arc is that not everybody has the same view about what should happen there. The models through the Itrc and that the Itrc are developing will enable us to explore some of those scenarios, the what if, and have people with different views sat in the room together having a discussion about what the art of the possible is.
By helping better decisions to be taken to support the development of one of the UK's most dynamic economic areas, NISMOD is already contributing to a brighter, more sustainable future. And at the other end of the scale, we've developed models for global network analysis, allowing researchers to put national issues into the context of global supply chains or planetary events, such as space weather disruptions and the disruption that COVID-19 has caused to shipping around the world. Infrastructure is mentioned directly in or contributes to all 17 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and in 121 of the 169 targets they're composed of. But achieving the SDGs requires the right kind of infrastructure, and that demands better decision-making. Decision-making that understands the performance of economic systems, that assesses future needs and whole-life project costs, that explores nature-based solutions and plans for net zero carbon, and that grasps the fundamental interdependence of infrastructure sectors and the risks they're exposed to. That kind of complex decision-making requires remarkable computing power. NISMOD is hosted at the Data and Analytics Facility for National Infrastructure, DAFNI, part of the world-renowned Rutherford Appleton Laboratory in Harwell, Oxford. By combining NISMOD with DAFNI's computer power, groundbreaking decision-making is possible today.
Thanks very much indeed, Tim, for that. I'm now going to just give a short presentation of some of the overviews and main achievements within the Itrc program. So let me press on. And actually, I should have said at the outset that and welcome to everyone who has joined us in the meantime. During that video, a number of people were joining in. I'm Jim Hall from the University of Oxford. And what that video underlined was some aspects of what we think is the distinctive approach that Itrc has developed. It emphasized the way in which we've been thinking about interdependencies between infrastructure systems, and we're focused not on the kit and the hardware necessarily, but on the services which infrastructure systems provide to people. As you've seen, a lot of what we've been doing has been around model development, simulation, visualization, and we do that because it enables us to test alternative futures and look at the performance of infrastructure systems before one actually goes about building them. The analysis we're doing is very spatial. It's place-based, and one needs to know the characteristics of particular places in order to understand the performance of infrastructure services. And we're using simulation to look into the future, to test alternative scenarios and understand the robustness of infrastructure systems to those scenarios, so that we can then devise options. We're not just talking about investments on the supply side, but also policy interventions and actions on the demand side to modify the use of infrastructure services. And we want to look at how they're going to perform under a range of different futures. What are the possible benefits which might be yielded? and what are the trade-offs, between quality of services, affordability, and environmental impacts, so that we can use that information to inform prioritization and sequencing of infrastructure investments and policies. There's a lot of modeling there, but we focus within the program also on the governance context, so how we use this type of evidence in order to inform decision making. And we think it's really important that all of that is done, because infrastructure decisions are such a big commitment and they have the potential to lock us into the future. So we've got to get them right. The main output from ITRC, as you saw in the video, is the NISMOD model. And I would characterize NISMOD in the following way. It broadly has two main components to it: a long-term planning component and a risk, resilience and vulnerability component. And within the Mistral program, the second program of ITRC, we went from the national perspective to a multi-scale perspective, to go from regional through national to the global scale. And this table here summarizes some of the applications of NISMOD at those different scales. And I'm just going to dive into a few of those. The first is the UK work at a national scale, which was also mentioned in the video. And within the Mistral program, the second phase of ITRC, we reconfigured our models of energy, transport, water, digital communications, and NISMOD now has this really complete and I think quite unique representation at quite a fine spatial scale of the interdependent networks in Britain. And that forms the middle of this setup where we look at the inputs to the modeling of scenarios. There was new work done by the University of Leeds to develop new high-resolution spatial population scenarios, economic scenarios from Cambridge Econometrics, and so on. And then we also input those strategies, those alternative options for infrastructure provision, in order to provide metrics of security of supply, affordability, and carbon emissions. And the main outputs for that, at the end of the first ITRC program, was our book, which documented all of this analysis. And then the new analysis has gone into the ICE's National Needs Assessment, the scenarios used by the National Infrastructure Commission, and some particular deep dives looking at the water sector, both the NIC's water analysis and water analysis by the Environment Agency. And we're going to talk a lot more about that analysis at the water webinar on the 4th of November. Going downscale, we focused on the Oxford-Cambridge arc, and in the University of Newcastle, developing really high-resolution scenarios for ways in which building development might take place in the arc. So these are two different scenarios: a high-density new settlement scenario, where the yellow bobs below, or a much more diffuse expansion scenario in the upper panel. And we use that to understand the sustainability of alternative development options for the arc. We've used that to in the report, which we launched last year, both in London and in Cranfield, and then subsequently have done work with England's economic heartland on decarbonising the regional transport strategy. And we're going to go into more depth on that at the ARC webinar on the 6th of October. Internationally, at the national scale, we've worked very closely with UN Ops and have basically distilled the NISMOD methodology and used a much simpler approach, but still based on a combination of geospatial data sets, system modeling, and evidence-based decision making, with work on the Sustainable Development Goals and infrastructure, and support for national infrastructure plans in St. Lucia, Curacao, and now Ghana. And all of that work on international development, we're going to be summarizing at the webinar on the 12th of October. Then on the risk and resilience side of NISMOD, we've created a extremely detailed network interdependencies model of Britain. This is certainly the most detailed model in this country, I think probably in the world, of interdependencies and cascading failure between infrastructure networks in order to identify points of vulnerability and the possible consequences of infrastructure failure. And we'll be talking more about that at the webinar on the 28th of October. And then that work has also been applied in a series of studies around the world with the World Bank in Tanzania. The panel on the left, you can see the flows on the transport network in Tanzania. In the middle, in Vietnam, we calculated the potential economic losses from infrastructure failure, transport infrastructure failure, and similarly in Argentina. And that is also going to be described at the Resilience webinar on the 28th of October. And from that, we've developed a series of tools which are open source and are being used here in Argentina and around the world to provide very in-depth analysis to enable prioritization of investments in infrastructure resilience. Finally, at a global scale, we're working very intensively to create global data sets for analysis of infrastructure resilience. We published a paper in Nature Communications with the World Bank, which was the first global analysis of 60 million kilometers of road and rail infrastructure and its vulnerability to a variety of natural hazards. And there's further work going on with the World Bank looking at transport infrastructure and indeed 5G infrastructure worldwide. So there's quite a legacy from all of the research that we've done. You can find all of that on the ITRC website, and we launched a new website today, actually, at itrc.org.uk. There's 260 publications apparently have come out of the research program, and we've had 73 staff and PhD students come through our program, which really provides us with a cohort of people who have got this approach to systems analysis and are taking it forwards in their careers. The codes for NISMOD are available as open source on GitHub, and NISMOD is implemented on the DAFNI system, which provides workflows and visualization tools so that without having to get all of the GitHub scripts going, one can run simulations and look at visualizations and do analysis like this for oneself. And as I said at the start, this is not ending. What's the future for ITRC? Certainly DAFNI is the data and analytics facility for national infrastructure is going to be the home of NISMOD, and DAFNI is part of UCRIC, the UK Laboratorium for Research on Infrastructure and Cities, which is taking off as a UKRI institute. We have support from the Alan Turing Institute, and some of the ARC work, which you've seen, is supported by the ATI. And we've had a number of EPSRC Impact Acceleration Awards, which are supporting the uptake of research. And if you're interested in more collaboration around to use the ITRC research, then the Impact Acceleration Awards were an opportunity there. We're looking forward to the spatial framework for the Oxford-Cambridge ARC, where the analysis that we're doing, I think, could be extremely powerful. And we're watching very carefully the steps towards creation of a national infrastructure federated digital twin, which in many senses NISMOD is a prototype for. We are working with RAPID, the Regulators Alliance for Infrastructure Development, in doing analysis for them of strategic national water infrastructure. And the global infrastructure risk and adaptation platform that I referred to is still taking shape with support from a number of different sources, including the World Bank. We have this strong collaboration with UNOPS, which is going from strength to strength. We launched the St. Lucia study tomorrow, in fact, and there are some significant initiatives in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office research program around climate compatible growth and high volume transport. So the international dimensions of ITRC are really taking a big step. So that's just to look at some of what the future holds. This is the near future. The other more detailed deep dives in our webinar series, and we welcome you to join all of those. Please note, especially the 5G and digital communications webinar on the 9th of November, which we haven't previously been able to announce the date, but that is now the date for that webinar. And with that, I'll close that really high-speed overview of what we've done in ITRC. And it's a great pleasure to hand over first to James Richardson and then to Mark Enzer to make a few remarks from their perspective before we open up the discussion. Just a quick word about the discussion. In order to ask a question, you need to write it in the chat. And I will look out for those and pose them either to our panelists or to our researchers, or I'll try and answer them myself. But before we start the discussion, let me hand over to James to make some remarks.
Thanks, Jim. And it's great to be here. It's great to be able to say thanks to you and your team for all the help that you've provided to the Commission over the last few years, but also to kind of look to the future in this area. As people will know, the National Infrastructure Commission have consistently been advocating for long-term vision, lasting plans and stable funding in place of the kind of stop-start and prevarication that too often has characterised UK infrastructure planning in the past. And we will only get these kind of plans that last if they are built on a robust and impartial evidence base. So, you know, the kind of work that Jim and his team have been doing has been absolutely central to, you know, developing the evidence base and that ability to take kind of better decisions in the future. We are very much hoping that this long-term view, this long-term approach will be reflected in the National Infrastructure Strategy from the government that we are still promised for the autumn, even though the budget has now been postponed. We are still told the National Infrastructure Strategy will be coming out shortly. And with that in sight, in a sense, you know, we're now starting to look to what the next set of challenges for UK infrastructure are likely to be. And we expect most of our work at the Commission to be focused around kind of three big themes over the next few years. So in their particular order, levelling up, kind of regional disparities, net zero, and broader kind of environmental questions, and recovery from the current COVID crisis and the role of infrastructure in supporting long-term economic growth. And I think each of these big themes offer some interesting challenges for the next generation of modelling. I won't talk about the kind of role of digital twins in all of that, because I know Mark will pick that up, but that's obviously important in all of this. But I can think of kind of a set of 3 challenges matching those 3 big themes for the next generation of models. So firstly, kind of non-linearities. We see this particularly in these challenges around regional disparities. We know these spatial disparities are driven by very powerful non-linear cycles of interactions between skills and jobs and housing markets, between decision making and infrastructure. And that just changing one thing, even making large scale interventions in one dimension, is unlikely to make a huge difference to the path that areas find themselves on. But conversely, if you can change multiple dimensions, if you can intervene across skills and jobs and across decision making and infrastructure, then you may be able to get places onto a completely different path. But most models aren't really set up very well to pick up these kind of deeply non-linear interaction type effects. And yet in some of the questions that we face, that actually may be the whole ball game, in a sense. The kind of straightforward, if I can call it that, kind of linear effects that are easier to establish and easier to model may actually not really add up to a huge amount. Secondly is around kind of how we address uncertainty, not so much in the modeling. I mean, modelers have always dealt with uncertainty. That's not new. Jim's talked a lot about kind of scenarios and so on. This is familiar territory. But really how we use that to kind of help decision makers think about, I think, 2 things in terms of the decisions that they make against the background of uncertainty that are often not, done very well in decision-making processes. The first is kind of that, given all this uncertainty, what decisions do I make now, and what decisions am I actually better to defer and take in future? I think there's a tendency amongst decision makers to kind of look through all the scenarios, pick their favorite position, and then say, this is the path I want to be on to 2050 or wherever it may be. Whereas often what you really want to be thinking about is, well, here are the decisions that I definitely want to make now. Here are a set of bets I might want to place on the next set of things where I'm not really taking a decision, but I'm definitely creating some optionality. And here are things where I'm definitely better to wait until some point in the future when there's more information. And thinking about how the modeling can help decision makers to operate in that kind of way, I think would be really valuable. And then the other half of this, I think, is just being a bit clearer about actually what are the judgments that decision makers just have to make for themselves. I think there's a natural tendency of modelers to try and do as much work on behalf of the decision maker as possible, to try and find parameter values for as many things as possible. But sometimes it may be better just to say to decision makers, you have to believe these 3 things if you think the future is going to turn out in roughly this space. And do you believe them? And not try and kind of answer all those questions for the decision makers. And then my third theme is around behavior change. And perhaps in some ways it's just an extreme example of uncertainty. But, do we really capture the kind of behaviors in our models that may change from big shocks like COVID, or major changes in social attitudes like, the change in women's working patterns that we've seen over the last 50 years, or the revival of city centres that we saw from the early 1990s. Perhaps that will go in reverse with COVID, but big social changes. If for example, COVID leads to fundamental changes in people's attitude to risk, as there is some evidence that the Great Depression in the 1930s did, can we pick up what that might do to people's behaviour across a whole range of sectors, a whole range of activities? So as we kind of celebrate what has been achieved, and I think there has been a great deal of progress here. It's been great to collaborate with the ITRC. I hope it's also good to know that there's plenty more for modelling community to be getting your teeth into, and certainly we at the Commission look forward to working with all of you on the next set of challenges over the next few years. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed, James. Whenever I speak to you, there's this combination of both being brought down to earth in recognizing what a small fraction of the big picture we've actually been able to take on, but also being inspired in terms of some really fascinating and important questions that you always pose to us. So thank you for that, James. Plenty to pick up on the discussion. So please keep on writing your questions, including for James in the chat. But let me now pass over to Mark for a few thoughts from you, Mark. Welcome.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So I've got a few slides here to share, so hopefully I can do that briefly. So I think I'm sharing. Can I have a thumbs up if I am? Yay, that's good. So what I'd like to do is pick up on some of the points that both Jim and James have made and show some connections into the National Digital Twin programme and hopefully point towards a future for the great thinking that ITRC has kicked off. Because it might be that ITRC in some ways is coming to an end, but NISMOD and DAFNI live on. And we certainly see those as having a really important role in the National Digital Twin going forwards. So the two bits I want to pick up on is firstly from James and the work of the National Infrastructure Commission. So I'd refer us all to this report that came out from the NIC called Data for the Public Good. It came out a couple of years ago and recommended that we should move towards having this thing called a National Digital Twin. And it's envisaged as being an ecosystem of connected twins. So this federation that Jim mentioned earlier, rather than one massive twin of everything. And in order to facilitate that, it was recommended that we'd have an information management framework. Now, this is really important and is effectively the thing that would unlock the National Digital Twin. It's what would enable the communication between twins. And thirdly, it recommended that we should pull together across government and industry and academia so that we all align and pull in the same direction towards the above things. So that's what was recommended. And just very briefly to say that CWB, where I'm working, our job is to deliver that information management framework and to enable the National Digital Twin. It's not our job to deliver it. It's the job of industry to do that. To go away and build the twins and to connect them up. But that needs to be enabled by some kind of open source solution where we might collaborate on the rules, compete on the game, and effectively open up a whole new category, a whole new market in digital twins and connected digital twins. So that's a kind of a connection into the National Infrastructure Commission. But then when it comes to the thinking of ITRC, you will recognize this diagram instantly because it's building so strongly on that systems view of our built environment. And therefore, I'm sure to people on this call, I don't need to make the argument that our built environment is a system of systems. But out in the industry, that argument still needs to be made because very often the industry sees itself as a series of construction projects rather than the system of systems of our built environment on which interventions are done to keep the system going. And so I think that the contribution of ITRC to systems thinking in the built environment is of massive importance and something that we absolutely have to build on for the National Digital Twin, because the National Digital Twin makes no sense in any other context. And I think it's in that context that we can see all the systems processes and the asset life cycles where digital twins can add value. You can imagine different digital twins, different shapes and sizes, different purposes, but generally what they're about is improving decision making in any one of these processes. So improving decision making about the use of our infrastructure, or the operation and maintenance of it, or the planning of it, or the design, or the build. You get where I'm going. Every single part of this process is something that digital twins can contribute to. And also, as Jim was explaining, the various different spatial scales going up to from regional, national, global, we can also see another set of scales kind of going from the asset to the network, to the sector level, to the national level. You can imagine different digital twins, like I say, of different shapes and sizes. And then when it comes to the national digital twin, what we're talking about is really enabling the connection between those twins. It's all about the data connection. I think that once we've seen the system, then we can imagine the cyber physical system. So I guess one point I would just want to make here, a very simple point, is that at the moment, it seems that in the wider industry, we're very familiar and actually very good at managing physical assets. We're not yet good at managing our digital assets, or even recognizing that they are assets. So we really do need to up the game on recognizing data and information in the code as genuine assets, and where we kind of build together digital assets and physical assets, we get smart, and we can imagine a cyber physical system of our infrastructure. And clearly digital twins and connected digital twins can contribute to the management and optimization of that. So very briefly, introducing digital twins, I guess people will be familiar with a basic definition of a digital twin being a digital representation of something physical. We think it can be other things too. So it can be a representation of assets, processes, and systems. But really, what makes it a twin, the thing that distinguishes it from a model, is that it connects the model with the thing that is being modeled by a data connection, which enables us to have that greater insight that drives those better decisions. And it's the decisions, the making better decisions, which is where the value is released to enable the better interventions, etc. Something that is very familiar to us on this call, because that's exactly what ITRC is all about at a national level. And then again, briefly, to indicate that when we have these digital twins, we can conceive of connections between them, and the connections are a data connection, and therefore, in order to facilitate the national digital twin, all we have to do, and maybe that's in inverted commas, is sort out secure, resilient data sharing across organizational and sector boundaries. That's really what the national digital twin is all about. That's what we have to unlock, and then we get the amazing benefits of that national digital twin. But I think an awful lot of the thinking and the kind of revelation of the value of it has come out of the work of ITRC. So I guess I'd like to end with that, kind of looking forwards very positively to where this all goes, but giving massive credit to what has already been achieved in ITRC and helping to show the way. So thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. And that's really exciting to see, in a sense, that we're just on the beginning of a journey here to create the National Infrastructure Digital Twin. And so much of what we've done within ITRC and the platform which DAFNI provides a building block for that journey. So I'm now going to open up the discussion and start responding to questions from this very large audience we have here now. Please write your questions in the chat. I'm afraid there are too many people online to be able to handle you speaking into your microphone. So can you write your questions into the chat? James and Mark are ready to answer questions, as am I, and a whole bunch of colleagues from ITRC who are on this call and ready to respond. So please go ahead with that. we've had a few questions already, and let me just tee up a couple of my colleagues in that there's a question from Jeremy Morley. Hello, Jeremy, from Ordnance Survey. Great to have you with us about data in the developing country context. And I'm going to suggest that Adrian Hickford from Southampton, who helped with a couple of those developing country studies, responds to that. And then we also have a question from Santiago Dunn about the Argentina work. And the short answer there is the World Bank report for Argentina is available, but also all of our scripts, which we use to do the analysis, are available on GitHub. And in a moment, I'll hand over to Tom Russell, who's our research software engineer, to say a little bit more about what's available on GitHub with the NISMOD code and scripts. But while Adrian and Tom just get geared up, I'll respond to a couple of other questions. The one from Melina, in terms of analysis at the city level. As you all have seen, Melina, our subnational analysis has been regional. Almost deliberately, we haven't focused particularly on cities because there's so much other research going on from a city perspective, including within UCRIC. And also we see cities as being embedded within broader networks. And so actually to understand the infrastructure performance of a city, you have to understand the infrastructure networks that it's embedded within. But if you're interested in that broader resilience, regional resilience perspective, then I'd be very happy to talk about that. And then quickly to Ben Piper. Welcome, Ben, on water infrastructure. Yes, you're right that what I've shown you is focused on public water supplies. We've done work within ITRC also looking at wastewater infrastructure. And of course, the direction of travel is to look at the fully integrated water cycle and to look at water quality as well as water quantity. And quite a lot of that is going on at a national scale, but you'll recognize, Ben, that there's still a bit more work to do to get that whole systems perspective at a national scale of water infrastructure. But I think we've made enormous progress, and the way in which a national perspective has been adopted by the Environment Agency and Ofwat and DEFRA, partly stimulated by the National Infrastructure Commission's work, is a really significant step in the right direction. So let me just briefly hand over to Adrian to say a bit more about data in developing countries.
Thanks, Jim. I was really only involved with the Curaçao aspect of these three projects that are listed in your question. We did a pilot study in Palestine that indicated the importance of getting somebody in country to help you provide data. A lot of the data that is gathered locally isn't necessarily available in any global data set. So you're reliant on the local governance to provide the data they have. A lot of it is mapping data, which I think is relatively good global coverage now, but the nature of the assets, the nature of the infrastructure systems and the way that they're used pretty much has to come from within the country themselves. St. Lucia and Curaçao are pretty small island states, so that's a relatively simple task to get all the asset information together. It would be more challenging, I think, to to get similar data for some of the developing countries that is perhaps slightly larger, but that's those data sets are as accessible as they can be, I suppose, and you have to rely on the in-country governance to provide it. Hope that helps.
Thanks a lot, Adrian. Tom has put the links to the Argentina work in the chat. Do you want to say any more about that, Tom?
I can say very briefly that those couple of links demonstrate the kind of range of projects that you'll find on the GitHub NISMOD organization. So we've got everything from sort of more generic libraries that support work in different ways, so that your kind of developers might make use of, model projects which actually have the individual models and kind of more to the analysis end, so representing a whole reproducible analysis in other GitHub repositories. So definitely a good range of things to browse through if you're that way inclined.
Great, thanks a lot, Tom. So we've got questions for both James and Mark. Olivia has asked around about nationalisation and the way that's factored into the Commission's work, and maybe that could be broadened to think about potential changes in the whole regulatory and ownership setup. And a question from Rachel Fisher to Mark Enzer about how a digital twin can be achieved in practice, and to what extent is it limited by data quality. And so while James and Mark are thinking about those, let me just respond briefly to Simon Hodgkinson, who's asked about the data that was used for the national resilience model. We were fortunate in working with the NIC on that, in that the NIC was able to bring in people from organisations like Network Rail and National Grid round the table to look at the model that we were developing and provide some feedback. But this is extremely difficult work. The devil is in the detail of how you represent interdependencies, and if one's looking at resilience, how quickly one can repair and recover. But what that type of modelling does is provide a shared space in which you can have those conversations and discover who's assuming what, in particular, what interdependencies exist which may have been overlooked. So in that sense, a model is a very useful tool to facilitate communication. But over to you, James, on ownership of infrastructure and how that uncertainty is factored in.
Thank you. It's a really interesting question. I won't comment on what the Labour Party's position may or may not be, but the broader question here, I think, is really interesting. It's something we looked at a bit in our regulation study that came out about a year ago. And I think what kind of comes out when you look at it is that ownership itself is perhaps not the most important thing. It's really about kind of decision making and how you structure decision making processes to get the right set of outcomes. Because even if you transfer ownership, you still have issues around, you know, consumer interests. You still have somebody who is essentially the kind of investor, whether that's the Treasury or private investors, who will worry about the cost of capital and the returns on their investment in it. And you still have societal interests around issues such as net zero, long-term resilience, which we know that markets will struggle with, but which we also know that, you know, government decision making in nationalised industries in the past has not necessarily dealt with very well. Part of the reason why we privatised many of these utilities was to get in investment, because there had been long backlogs. So in the water sector, there'd been a chronic shortage of investment in water quality under the nationalised model. So those same kind of tensions exist really regardless of where ownership sits. And it's really about getting the right parties to make the right decisions in the right decision framework so that you get the kind of right outcomes. And I won't go into all the details because we've set it all out in our regulation study as to how we see that should be done. But clearly it needs to start with a long-term vision from the government on behalf of society of what we are trying to achieve. So net zero is a good example of that. On the resilience side, we have called for clear resilience standards saying, what is it that we should be able to expect as a society from our utility provision and at what cost. And we're hoping that, kind of government will respond positively to those recommendations. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, James, and over to Mark. Just keeping an eye on time here. We're at 5 o'clock. We're going to keep on going until about 10 past the hour, and then I'm afraid going to have to close. But Mark, you'll have seen the questions in the chat there about making a digital twin happen. And actually, that also leads quite nicely into a couple more questions. One from Jeremy Morley. Around how do we keep the NISMOD data live, and another one from let me see, on how do we acquire more data for NISMOD. But over to you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll keep it brief, but I think Rachel is exactly right to put her finger on this question of quality. It really is key, and we need to sort out the quality of data. But I think that we need to recognise that quality only has meaning in relation to the purpose to which the data is put, and data of different quality for different purposes would be totally expected. So I think, if we're driven by purpose and what it is that we want to use that data for, and kind of work back from what decisions we're trying to make through the type of analysis we need to do of what kind of data, we can get to the required quality of that data. And what might be of sufficient quality for one purpose might not be for another. I think that this issue of quality, though, is absolutely central, and part of what the information management framework is about is helping to set up the rules for quality and consistency of data. And we think that it's at the centre of some of the principles around guiding the development and use of the National Digital Twin. We outlined that in something called the Gemini Principles, and in there, one of the biggest things is around trust. And in order for the National Digital Twin to be trusted, or even for it to be trustworthy, we reckon we need to address security and openness and quality. So it's right in there. I think, Rachel, you're exactly right. And then very briefly, on the keeping NISMOD live, I might be a bit cheeky in saying this, but I would say this, wouldn't I, is that one really good way of doing it would be to create a data connection to sector digital twins. I really hope that we can do that and be feeding NISMOD with data from these sectors, because we kind of need that NISMOD level analysis, but it does need to be fed with real data from real sectors.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Mark. Not cheeky at all, I would say, because I think that has to be the direction of travel. We've got a real immediate challenge coming up. NISMOD has been migrated onto DAFNI. DAFNI is the repository for that data. Rollo asked about how do we know what's there? Well, that's all catalogued, and so one can see from the metadata what's there. But keeping that up to date, literally, who's going to pay for the maintenance of that data, beyond the end of March, when DAFNI development phase is completed, is a very practical challenge which we're really working on at the moment. A quick response to Colin, who's asked about the ARC and other areas of the country where development might take place. There's a substantive answer to this which I hesitate on, and then there's a methodological answer which I'm more comfortable on. Clearly, the ARC is a place with a great deal of development potential because of the amount of knowledge-based industry, the number of spin-outs that are coming from the universities, and that's why the National Infrastructure Commission identified it in the first place. But on the other hand, in the context of levelling up, many other parts of the country which clearly have much more development potential in the sense that they're starting from a position of being less productive than the ARC. And so there are much bigger gains to be made in many other parts of the country. As I hinted in my answer to the question about cities, we focused on the ARC because it was actually a very kind of interesting regional geography to use a model like NISMOD to analyze. But we could apply that type of methodology in many other different regional perspectives. And in fact, in follow-on work with the Alan Turing Institute, which Ali Ford is leading, we're looking at the Northeast as well as the ARC. Methodologically, what we've done with the ARC is clearly transferable, and what we're trying to do is develop a set of methodologies which could be used at a regional scale anywhere in the country. Now, I'm scanning down the questions, and actually Ali Ford has come in with a remark about that. Do you want to just say a bit more, Ali, about that follow-on work in the North as well as in the ARC?
Yeah, so the follow-on funding, and we'll be talking more about this on the 6th of October in the ITRC webinar then, but the follow-on work will be extending the modelling from the Oxford-Cambridge ARC region up to the Northern Powerhouse region as well. We really want to try and develop models that are generic and transferable and use widely available data where possible. So we see this as a really good test of our modelling capabilities if we can kind of port it to a new region. I mean, clearly then there are different contexts, there are different policy drivers, there are different sets of decision makers, but the whole concept of trying to build models that allow that kind of decision making to be explored is transferable to anywhere in the UK.
Great, thanks very much indeed for that, Ali, and thank you also for reminding us about the webinars that are coming up. We seem to have be coming to the end of the questions. We're certainly coming to the end of time. So let me just once again put up this list of the next webinars in this series. Thanks very much indeed for joining this first webinar. Thank you in particular to James and to Mark for sharing your thoughts with us. And we're looking forward to seeing you at all of these forthcoming webinars. Keep on tweeting and keep looking at the new ITRC website where you'll be able to find a lot more information. But thanks again, and let's draw things to a close of this first webinar now.